So Nigel Gresley was one of those engineers who came up through the ranks. I mean to say, although he'd been to private school, he went to Marlborough College, he actually went to Crew Works, and he worked in Crewe when it was actually a real university of steam. He worked his way up until he ended up in charge of all the carriages and wagons on the Great Northern, and then finally they gave the young man the job of the newly formed London North Eastern Railway. So he did think about the people that used his machines as well as what the machines were for. And he's somebody who looked abroad. He visited Canada, he visited South Africa. He was good friends with André Chapelon, the genius of steam, who was the engineer who lived in France. And he knew the people in Germany as well. So Gresley was somebody who was open to influences, travelled and looked to see what he could to improve, not only to make money for the company for which he worked so that the engines could do what they should do, but also to make sure the crews could actually enjoy what they were doing. So he was somebody who did think about the ergonomics of cab design. So when you sit down in a Gresley Pacific, you're in a seat and all the controls are at hand.
Well, in the first place, we've got what they call a regulator. That regulates the speed or the steam going into the cylinders. The next thing is your brake. That puts 21-inch vacuum each side. That's a train pipe. When you're stood in a station, you try and level that to about 15. That holds all the train, because there's no engine brake on here at all. Then when you get right away, your reverser now is in mid-gear, so you drop it down to about 65. Then you take your brake off, and have it slow coming off, and put the big blower up, straight up. Then you bring it down again so it's level. You then put this into 65, on your regulator, and away you go. Once you've observed the guard and the signals. The whistle is for warning people that you're going to move, either backwards or forwards. You can't see people right at the front of this engine. So you give one on the whistle, and they should move out of the way. Also, it was used for information to the signal, because the signal boxes were fairly close to the track, and if you were moving from one point to another one, say you're going into the loco, you would give so many short whistles to tell him which road you're on and where you were going to, and he would pull the points off that you needed to get to the shed. You had a 15-year apprenticeship as a fireman. But you could do it quite easy. I mean, when I was 16, I was driving them anyhow on the shed. So you learnt all that before you even became a driver. That's all part of your training. And when you were cleaning engines, you'd all be in here and you were telling one of the other tales how to fill up the back corners, how to level the fire off, all that sort of stuff.
I was born in January 1938, the same year as Mallard came out of the railway works at Doncaster, the same month. So we are twins. But I didn't go on to break a world speed record in the following July. But then again, Mallard is now static and I'm still moving. It was a very old family, the Gresleys. The family home of Drakelow, which was built in the 14th century. And Netherseal was close by in Derbyshire. Well, it started off in Leicestershire, and then there was a boundary change and it became Derbyshire. There's a churchyard where there are 3 Gresleys buried, and just down the road towards the village hall, there's a cemetery where my grandparents are buried, and another 7 Gresleys. So it was prolific for them. But they go back over many years. His father and several of the Gresleys before him were vicars of Netherseal. I think in those days, in Victorian times, it was a very respectable job for gentlemen to go into. Wealthy people married their daughters off to vicars. No, I think vicars were highly thought of in those days. He was actually born in Edinburgh, and problems with the birth were suspected, and his mother was sent up to an eminent gynecologist to try and help with any problems that may arise. He was slightly premature. There was trouble in the birth, and while the doctors were working on the mother, the newborn baby was lying in a corner, thoroughly neglected, until somebody suddenly spotted it and started tending to it. Otherwise we may never have had him. And then within a few days they travelled back to Netherseal by train, so whether the sound of the train. Nigel was a very common name in the Gresley family. Nearly every generation had a Nigel in it. My grandfather was called Herbert Nigel Gresley. Herbert was after Sir Herbert Oakley, who was a great friend of the family and wrote many of our hymns, and he was a godfather to Sir Nigel. And in fact, in the early years, he was always known as Master Herbert in the house, and until somebody poked their head round the door of the nursery and this little boy was playing in the nursery, and the visitor said, "And what's your name?" He said, "My name's Tiny Tim." And from then on, he was always known as Tim, and that's why I was called Tim. He was encouraged at his school, Marlborough, to pursue engineering interests, which he showed a great aptitude for. Rather than go on to university from Marlborough, he immediately got stuck into work. He wanted to get moving, and started off with an apprenticeship with the great John Aspinall, and worked his way up at an extremely rapid rate from then.
Well, the A4s, locomotives, they were designed for a specific job. They were designed to go fast, particularly go fast uphill. And that streamlined shape was acquired from Gresley's travels. It comes from the Bugatti rail cars in France, and they tested it in the National Physical Laboratories and thought, yeah, that'll do. And the actual workings of those machines was all around, could you actually run a train from London to Newcastle in under 4 hours?
The A4s, they were the racehorse of the group. You could really go fast in one of those.
The LNER did look at some diesel rail cars running in Germany in the 1930s called the Flying Hamburgers, but the Germans couldn't guarantee the 4-hour service. So Gresley was said, well, could you design something that will do that? Took a sprinkling of Chaperon's ideas, the streamlined shape and so on, and came out with the A4, which delivered that 4-hour service. And from that, they started rolling out the country's first high-speed train network. And in amongst all that, they discovered these trains were going so fast that they needed to do something about the braking system. So they started developing the quick-acting brake with the company Westinghouse. Mallard was the first locomotive from the A4 class to be fitted with a new device, the Kyle Chap exhaust, which really made the locomotive work a lot better. And they were in the middle of a major testing of the quick-acting brake. So Gresley, who was always one interested in experimentation, he asked the guy who was dealing with the brake tests, Norman Newsom, Do you think we could beat the LMS, who at that stage had got the country speed record for speed, 114 mile an hour? They'd nearly killed everybody going into cruise station rather too fast, but nobody took much notice of that in those days. And Newsom said, yeah, I think we could do it. We took one set off and put the dynamometer car on. In theory, it was a brake test for Westinghouse, but when Westinghouse people turned up to look at the train, they realised it wasn't the same train as they'd been testing up until now. They'd taken two coaches off and they'd put the dynamometer car on the front, and they said, what's going on here? So they were offered taxis to go home again because they'd already decided this was going to be a fast run. And they'd got the driver for the job, Duddington. He's 62 years old, and he'd already driven a locomotive at very high speeds for a long distance before. Tommy Bray, the fireman, was there, and Sam Jenkins was the inspector, and he'd worked on the developing the high-speed trains on the LNER. So they had the crew, and Gresley had given one of his colleagues his own stopwatch to make sure they timed it properly. Dynamometer car had been adjusted so that the paper trace that went through it went a bit quicker, so that everything was in place for a fast run. And they thought they'd informed everybody. Unfortunately, when they left Barkston, they approached Grantham, and there was a permanent way slack approaching Grantham, so they didn't go through Grantham at 60 miles an hour. They went through Grantham at something like 25 miles an hour, up the bank as fast as they possibly could. And when they went up the bank, they topped out on the top of Stoke Bank, not as fast as previous runs had done it. So Duddington opened it up. The recording that was done in 44 is there, come on, old girl. And he basically blasted it as hard as he could down the bank. But they had to slow down for Essendine. They'd just about topped out, well over 120 miles an hour for a number of miles. They'd peaked at least 125 miles an hour. Then they jammed the brakes out for Essendine. The speed through Essendine was supposed to be 90. They were doing about 108. Things rocked and rolled a bit as they went through Essendine. Then they smelt the front middle big end had run hot. They got into Peterborough. They knew they'd broken the record. They'd beaten the LMS. They didn't really know how fast they'd gone because that required them to look at the speed record that was on the paper trace in the dynamometer car. But they knew they'd done beaten the LMS, so that was good enough for them. So a new Empire record was declared to the press. And at the time they claimed 125 miles an hour, but they later examined the paper trace and decided it must have been 126 miles an hour. So Nigel Gresley himself was not happy with that claim because as far as he was concerned, he'd beaten the LMS 120 miles an hour. 125 miles an hour, well, that was a world record. And it was only a short period of time it had done 126. But post-war, they decided they'd put a plaque on the side of the locomotive that said fastest locomotive in Britain, well, fastest locomotive in the world, 126 miles an hour. And that really meant that the LNER was the fastest of the four that formed part of British Railways in 1947.
My grandfather was Joseph Duddington. He was a top shed driver with the LNER, operating out of Doncaster on the East Coast Line between King's Cross and Edinburgh. And the events that have proved to be a legend was created on the 3rd of July 1938 when he and his fireman, Tommy Bray, took out the locomotive Mallard 4468 on what was scheduled to be a brake test. That was something of a front because there was a competition not readily acknowledged but fact to see who could go the fastest, whether it was an LNER train designed by Sir Nigel Gresley and built at Doncaster, or whether it was an LMS train, locomotive, engineered by LMS engineer Stanier, Mr. Stanier. They had achieved speeds approaching 120 miles per hour, but the German locomotive industry were battling to raise the stakes, and they were looking to get to speeds of in excess of 120 miles an hour and recorded speeds of 124 miles an hour. In the event, however, the brake tests that were scheduled had to take into account the state of track at the time and the state of the locomotive. Now, Mallard was comparatively new. It was built at Doncaster and it was just deemed to be nicely run in by the 3rd of July.
Well, it wasn't actually faster. The only reason the Mallard got the high-speed run because it was only about 4 months old when it was built. And it also had a double clap exhaust pipe on. K-clap, I think they called it, whereas the others didn't. So you got better steaming through having a double blast pipe.
And the traffic superintendent at Doncaster said that Joseph Duddington was the driver and he would be the best man to drive this particular schedule, with Bray as his fireman. And so that was that. Early on the Sunday morning, they reported to the shed and lit the fire to warn the locomotive, ready to take to the road. Now, that is very much history. The fact that there were speed restrictions on the track caused certain delays to start with, but eventually the running speed coming through a station called Little Bytham was recorded to be in excess of 123 mile an hour. And my grandfather's quote at the time was, "Come on, old girl, you can do better than that." And so it was. And he worked as fireman to such an extent that he reckoned that Tommy Bray lost about a stone on the run in weight. He made up for it in beer afterwards, but after passing through Little Bytham, the track dropped slightly through Stokes Bank, and it was at that stage that the dynamometer crew reported that the speed was over 125 miles per hour, and that they were concerned about the crossing at Essendine as to whether the locomotive could travel that at that sort of speed. In the event, however, a mishap occurred that had been planned for. There was built into the mechanism what they called a stink bomb, and if the heat in the pistons got to such an extent it was overheating, the stink bomb would go off and they could shut down. Now, Duddington being Duddington, pressed on with what he had. He knew he was doing 125, so he pushed the regulator through to the end and he actually hit the record of 126 mile an hour. The stink bomb went off and they had to close down, shut off and coast into Peterborough.
And that was then the country record, and at the time it was claimed as the Empire record. Subsequently it was realised it was in fact the world record for steam locomotives. Gresley, of course, wasn't on the train. He was already getting a bit ill really by that stage, and a telegram read, "LMS out for a duck," and that was really the end of that story.
He died of a heart attack. He had been warned by his doctors for quite some time that he should ease off his workload. And he never did. He never eased off at all. He felt that with the war imminent and starting, that everybody else was making maximum effort for the war effort, and he couldn't let people down and not do the same.
As soon as the war started, all the express trains slowed down. The country was taken over by freight trains. troop trains and so on, and boom in passenger traffic. And really, it didn't recover high-speed train network until well into the 1950s, by which stage steam was beginning to be seen as a thing of the past. And although Sir Nigel Gresley got the record for the post-war record, the thing is 112 in 1959, steam never really challenged that speed that Mallard had, 126 miles an hour. And of course, the rest of Europe was completely bombed out. We'd made sure of that. And so they took a long time to recover. And Europe post-war went for electrification. So the steam record was not challenged. By the time America got into the 1950s, it had also moved out of steam into the big oil economy with diesel trains. So Mallard's record basically survived. Now we are 75 years later, and no steam engine has gone faster in the world.
The directors agreed to call the last of the locomotives after the designers, Sir Nigel Gresley. And my grandfather always felt that that locomotive was built taking into account what they'd learned from Mallard and its history, and that eventually that may well make a stab at the record. But the Second World War came and it was never pursued.
If you'd have had the long welded rail last today and the colour light system, you could have gone a lot faster. Because in those days, the tender would be going one way and the engine would be going another way, also bouncing up and down. You had a job to hang on sometimes if you're doing 100 miles an hour. But also, most of the points, say you turned in at Corby, anywhere like that at Grantham, were only 15 miles an hour. And there was a lot of them. So every time you hit a set of points, the engine used to kick over.
He always said that it would have done 130 miles per hour. But given the problem with the third cylinder overheating, it was never to be. And I think he was quietly surprised as well as pleased when the speed was recorded as a record of 126 miles an hour.
The rivalry between the East Coast lines and the West Coast lines goes right back to when they were first built. And no sooner did the East Coast lines built the East Coast joint stock and got a working agreement for through train up the East Coast main line between the three companies that owned it, which actually leads you to the Flying Scotsman in 1862, then the West Coast main line did the same thing and had the West Coast joint stock. And you ended up with races to the north in the 1890s, proving costly and indeed dangerous. So they ended up agreeing a set time for London to Edinburgh between the West Coast and the East Coast. 7.25 hours, I think, might have been the time, which is what it was when Flying Scotsman started hauling the train non-stop in 1928. You get into the 1930s and you've got Stanier on the West Coast for the LMS. He takes his time to basically get the LMS to start working together between Derby and Crewe. East Coast Main Line has got the L and the R, and really the main locomotive works is Doncaster under Gresley. Gresley's an innovator. He starts pushing the limits. They do that test with Flying Scotsman in 1934, whereby it does 100 miles an hour. The fastest locomotive in the country at that time, because the Great Western record was never really authenticated, and the Flying Scotsman had a dynamometer car behind it. Anyway, once that happens, the LMS and the LNER get into straight competition, because what they're really competing for is a long-distance market, and we're just getting into paid holidays.
And on a Saturday morning, we had 48 used to go out to Butlins alone.
So people are exploring places, and they're exploring the west of England. West of England is mostly the Great Western. They're exploring the south, but they're quite short journeys. They're exploring the Lake District, and they're exploring Scotland. Holiday trains to Scotland start to take off, so saying that you have the most comfortable and the quickest route to Scotland is quite useful in your marketing. So obviously you get rivalry between the two sides. And also the chief engineers of the two railways, although they're good friends, are trying different approaches to power output and to design. So as soon as one does a speed record, then the other one is also quite interested, seeing if he can beat his friend's record.
My grandfather was absolutely devastated when his wife died in 1929, and Sir William Stanley lost his wife early as well. My grandmother died of cancer, and my mother stepped in as my grandfather's hostess, both socially and business-wise. She used to travel abroad with him. She was very close to him indeed. She was his eldest daughter of 5 children, and they were very, very close indeed. So we learnt a lot about him as a man from mother. And Sir William Stanley's daughter Joey became his close companion as well. And Joey and my mother were best friends, so they couldn't be much closer. I used to get a Christmas and a birthday card every year signed by Uncle Will. And as he got older and older and older, because he lived far longer than my grandfather did, then the writing got more and more spidery as the years passed by.
On the London to Edinburgh run, the locomotive would burn 7 tons of coal and drink 5,000 gallons of water. And through Nigel Gresley's foresight, he redesigned the tender to have a passageway so that the crew could change on the move. They didn't have to stop at York, which had been the case prior to that. And so halfway the crew would change over, and they took on water from a wooden trough that was laid at the side of the track.
The Mallard was all right. It didn't steam all that well, but you could manage it. It was, say, easier work than an A1. An A1 had a lot bigger firebox, and you could put easy 5 ton of coal in a firebox in an A1 compared to an A4. You maybe only burn 3 ton of coal to London from Doncaster, whereas an A1 you could burn a lot more.
When it came in, lo and behold, a streamline train, it was a Mallard. And as I remembered that in 1938, it had broke the record. Of course, we didn't do, we was I would say it was going at good speed, but I don't know what. There was less coal and water than any one, and it was a gem to drive. When you pulled it up and did a bit of speed with it, it was wonderful. The wind, when you looked out of the window, the wind in your face was good. And it was my ambition to drive not only the Mallard, to drive a streamline loco, and I drove one or two. Very good. Lovely.
Streamlined. Well, that was mainly to lift the steam from the chimney over the driver. If you had a wind blowing from that side, it would curl over this side and the driver couldn't see where the signals. He used to rely on the fireman to tell him what the signals were. But most drivers, like myself, we knew exactly where every semaphore was and every caution, because you can't stop these on a sixpence. If you were travelling at, say, 80, 90 mile an hour, one of these, it'd take you nearly 2 miles to stop, unless you give a violent emergency brake pressure.
See, some locos were left-handed drive, the Gresleys and these. Others were right-hand drive. With a left-handed drive, you were sat near the driver to fire the loco. But I was lucky because I'm left-handed. So with all the Gresleys, I fired them easy. No trouble to the driver. Drivers preferred the left-hand drive because, as you know, the left-hand drive is the up road, right-hand is the down. You could see better out of Gresley. You see, some of the locals are a bit hard to see through the window. You had to put your head out. But with the Gresleys, you could see pretty easy, no problem. The engineer that designed them was a marvellous engineer. He was a friend of the fireman, and it's also the driver. The design of the loco was to suit both firemen and drivers, and it did.
The 1930s is always also a period of speed records. So you've got the Schneider Trophy, which a supermarine down in Southampton is trying to get seaplanes to go really quickly. Thank goodness for that, because out of that you get the Spitfire. And you've got Campbell driving his car as fast as he can, and also having a speed record on water as well. So there's a lot of speed records. And you've got the start of the real mass start of things like the Tourist Trophy in the Isle of Man on motorcycles, which ends up with a George Formby film and so on. So speed, is the spirit of the age at that time. Mallard and Coronation, the two rivals on the LNER and the LMS, it's not really surprising that you'd have the two companies vying for that record and vying for that publicity, which they think will sell seats on their trains. Well, when Mallard broke the record, it's a triumph for Dandridge, who's the advertising manager of the LNER, because the record is being broken on a Sunday, and in those days, the press didn't file copy that quickly, and certainly not on a Sunday afternoon. They'd be at home. Dandridge had the right people waiting for the train to arrive in London, King's Cross, so that they could file copy that night, which would be the following morning would be in the papers, a new Empire record. But unfortunately, when the train arrived in King's Cross, the engine wasn't there, because Mallard had run a hot box on the run and it had been taken off at Peterborough, overheated middle big end, and they ran into London with the predecessor for Mallard, an old Ivot Atlantic, but the control of the press was total. The press were taken on board the dynamometer car. They were shown the speed traces. They interviewed some of the chaps available then, and somebody already had some pictures of Mallard ready printed, which were given out to the press, and the press filed a copy, a new British Empire record. So it was a superb piece of PR, really, by the LNER's chief man for that, Dandridge, who, of course, at that stage was sort of inventing industrial PR on a mass scale. And the LMS were pretty good at it themselves, so that when they had their 114 mile an hour record, it was the same, and there was a picture of the driver enjoying a glass of beer and all the rest of it. So, yeah, at that stage, the railway companies were really beginning to take proper control of press and marketing, and we can see that by the posters of the 1930s. Go by train, it's faster by rail. Speed to the west is a famous poster of that period. Again, straight away, if I can speak that slogan now, it must have power, yet it was invented in that period of time. So they were absolutely masters of the art. In the UK, we tend to talk about steam locomotives, but the Germans had had an electric single rail car do 130 miles an hour in 1903. By the time you get into the 1930s, the fastest scheduled train in the world is the diesel-powered Flying Hamburger. The world is beginning to realise that actually the way forward is probably electric trains, and diesels may have a part to play in that as an interim measure. Going fast with steam is something you do if, like in the UK, you sit on a huge reserve of coal and you're thinking that these things will do until you can move to electric power. The actual world record holder in the interwar period is a propeller-driven vehicle in Germany that did 143 miles an hour in something like 1934. So when we're talking about records, the speed records are elsewhere in technological terms. But the steam speed record, which is what Mallard claims, of course, there is a German rival, 05002. Now, 05002 does 120 miles an hour for long distances and peaks at about 124.5 miles an hour, just below Mallard's claimed record when Gresley was in charge. What's going on then is, of course, the German state is already part of the Nazi dictatorship. I mean, Nazis coming in Germany in 1933. The German railways, Deutsche Reichsbahn, always been an independent group, and Deutsche Reichsbahn feel rather threatened by this new government in charge, because the new government in charge starts building autobahns. Over here, we notice the autobahn programme. We start building the trunk roads, the A roads. So the LNER feels just as threatened by the road building programme. But in Germany, the Germans decide to do a big tour for the German High Command at that time, because they want to persuade them really that the railways are still worth the money. On the tour back, pulled by 05002, somebody told me it runs a little bit late. So they decide, well, they've got to be in Berlin on time, which is how they come to do that record-breaking run of 124.5 miles an hour. So the German record is just the same as the British record. It's about PR, about marketing, really. Although actually by that stage, technology was showing the way forward, and the technology that was showing the way forward was not steam. Mallard's record run, of course, was preceded by a number of high-speed runs with the A4s, and they'd already done 113 miles an hour on an ordinary passenger train, so they were well aware that these machines could go really fast. Gresley was so aware of that he made sure they were fitted with a Flammen speed recorder, although it's retrofitted because it's under the fireman's seat. But the key thing about that is it's actually a recorder whereby you can take the paper trace out and show how fast you were going at a certain point on the journey. So drivers couldn't say, well, I wasn't really sure how fast I was going because those things ride so well. They could actually say, no, look, sorry, you came through Essendon doing 110 and you should be doing 90 mile an hour. Can you watch out next time, please? So when Mallard does its run, all Duddington is given as an instruction is basically see if you can beat the record. Almost certainly they were hoping to do 130 miles an hour with it, which it would have been capable of. Unfortunately, the word hadn't gone out fully, so that when they set off from Barkston, they come through Grantham, and there's a speed restriction on in Grantham, probably at Barrowby Junction, which is just short of Grantham. And then, basically, Duddington flogs it uphill, up Stoke Bank.
Everything to do with the LNER came under his orbit. Everything. He was very, very attentive on comfort in the carriages. Things like heating and electric light and hairdressing shops and bars and goodness knows what, as well as the comfort of the seats and so on. And they were also very competitive situation with other of the big four railways, the LMS, the Southern Railway and GWR, for speed and efficiency. And the faster people could get up to Scotland, the more attractive it was for people to buy tickets, which is what it was all about. There was a terrific pride in the locomotives and the rolling stock in those days. They were kept spotlessly clean. All the maintenance staff and so on had them polished and clean. You very rarely saw a dirty engine. Well, there are organisations in the country to this day that are locating and acquiring what was called the Gresley Teaks, which were particularly beautiful carriages. There's a joke of going around that you always call the LNER ones carriages and the other rails are coaches. But they are identifying them in all sorts of places like canteens and pub car parks and goodness knows what, and bringing them for restoration, which is an enormous and very expensive job. And the outside cladding of these coaches is teak, genuine teak, with 16 coats of varnish on, generally. And the two largest that I know of are the Severn Valley Railway, where they have a separate organisation called the LNER brackets SVR close brackets Coach Fund, and also on the North Yorkshire Moors Railway there is also a very efficient organisation restoring Gresley Teaks. I think there are some others around the country, but I'm not so familiar with them. Well, certainly from what I've heard, his wear very, very upmarket, but I have no reason to believe that the other railways weren't equally striving for that sort of comfort for their passengers.
Well, Mallard 75 is a great thing to do. They have 6 surviving A4 locomotives here together. But locomotives, the important bit about locomotive is the driver and the fireman, the crew, the people that made it go, that delivered day in, day out those high-speed timings on a locomotive which until the 1950s didn't even have any kind of ATC, automatic train control. You know, it was basically up to the driver to deliver that service. So we thought it would be a good idea to go out there and talk to contacts we have in the rail industry and contacts that we have in the preserved railway world to see who they knew out there who'd worked A4s in the BR era, or who'd worked A4s in preservation, or who'd been on Mallard in 1988 when last time it was in steam, to see what they could tell us, to see what their stories were. And straight away we've had stories from people who've contacted us and they've said, oh yes, well, I had this driver and he drove far too fast, you know, and really he went past this signal at danger, and by the time he'd noticed how far he'd gone, he was only 2 carriage lengths off a freight in front. This kind of thing. The kind of harum-scarum stories which aren't written down. You won't find them in the history books about the railways, which are very often very technically based, and yet they bring these machines to life. And they also show you why dents are on the locomotive backhead, why bits and pieces are as they are, because these were tools. These were used by people, and the people that use them are the people that can best tell you how they were used. And that's who we're talking to in this gathering in October. Well, people have been getting in touch with the Railway Museum by phone, by email, by coming to these events and hearing about us and contacting us. And we've got a little form that people are filling in, telling us which shed they were at, where they worked, when they worked, so that we can try and do a sort of friends reunited with steam locomotives, which will mean that people hopefully will meet people they've not seen for years. And it will mean that we can put up photographs of these sheds and people at work and get people identified that we otherwise wouldn't know, which helps us long term with the way we interpret the way these machines are and the stories that we tell about the collection that we have.
I understand that he would quite often take out his stopwatch from his pocket or his pocket watch and check that a train on its way from London to Scotland, which was within earshot, was running on time. He was firm but fair. If he thought somebody wasn't pulling their weight, if they were slacking, he'd come down on them very hard. So I've read. But his sense of humour and his the affection that his workforce had for him, and his terrific, wicked sense of humour in the family was brilliant.
Platform 2, please stand behind the yellow line. Fast train passing through. Awaiting the arrival of the Mallard. We expect it to arrive at Grantham in approximately 12
What would give my grandfather a great deal of satisfaction would be to see how the legend has developed with all the people that are here today, all the people that came on the 70th anniversary, would be something that would have moved him quite seriously, that he was recognised for what he did. And the legend that was created in this particular class of locomotive, 30 odd of them that were produced, all by the Doncaster Works. As far as he was concerned, it was a brake test. On the face of it, that was what it was, and in the back of his head, he knew that he was going to make a stab at the record, and come what may, that was going to happen.
They were the easiest loco with coal and water that I've ever been on. You use less coal and water with a Gresley than any other loco. And the way they moved, they were very wonderful loco. Easy to drive when you got used to them, easy to fire, and as I say, they were a wonderful loco. The best loco I've ever been on, without a doubt, and I've been on a lot.